Hello and welcome everyone to our second day of the expert meeting around COP27 to 28 key issues at stake in the Arab region. Today we will be discussing just transition, climate finance, and then we will conclude with key messages to convey at COP28. Our first section will be facilitated by Ms. Sarine Karajerjian and presented by Ms. Hilary Kang. Please briefly introduce yourself to the attendees and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, ANND and colleagues. It's great to be in this room surrounded by friends and colleagues. And it's always good to remind ourselves as why are we also talking about climate change in a times where we are going through conflict in our region. And this is 2 days ago, actually, we were discussing in 2006, I was working at, I was volunteering actually at the United Nations Environment Program as a post-conflict branch. And by then we were looking at how war is affecting the environment when we had war in Lebanon, specifically the oil spill, different lands that were, and water that was hit. 17 years later, we're still at war. It's like a never ongoing and never ending process that we are going through in our region where war is still affecting the environment and vice versa. Today, to introduce myself, my name is Sarine Karajerjian. I'm the director of the Environmental Politics Program at the Arab Reform Initiative. Our program, we look at the environment from a politics side, as we cannot think of the environment from a technical perspective. It's always the engineers and, finding solutions to our environmental problems. Our role is to look at the politics, the governance, who is responsible today of the many challenging and environmental problems that we're facing in our region and, of course, in Lebanon. So I was asked to say a few words around the just transition. And what does just transition mean? The concept itself has just and transition both. So it has been brought as a concept in the 70s and 80s by a group of workers who used to work in different refineries and enterprises in the US. And their main reason is, okay, you're going to phase out fossil fuel. What will happen to those workers if they are left out of a job? What types of job will they find? So from this concept, this is how it started in the 70s and 80s. But this concept is very also new to our region. Many of the times we look at also what are the different definitions. And here I'd like to give a few quotes from a paper we are publishing with certain colleagues at the Arab Reform Initiative. And I'll quote some of the activists who are with us. And of course, I have their consent. I'll quote Amjad Bani Isa, who's an activist in Jordan. And for him, the region currently has received a mere of $1.6 billion for almost 164 approved climate change projects over the past 2 decades. And the majority of this fund has been allocated to large-scale mitigation projects, while adaptation, as we know, and it was discussed yesterday as well, and resilience building efforts have been neglected. This is despite the fact that the region is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So when we look at this, what does it mean today? We are at the margin of the conference of parties at the end of this year at the UAE. And this conference of parties is considered as an Arab COP. What does it mean for climate finance? And we're seeing this more and more around the issue of climate finance. So what are these? Are these loans that are going to be given to countries of the region, when we know that many of the countries of the region, such as Lebanon, Syria, and even Egypt, we are going through many debts? Does it mean that we have to continue on paying these debts on forever and ever? And what are the conditions of these recipient or receiving these funding? Another quote also from another activist. It is clear that there is a growing movement today for climate justice in the Middle East and North Africa region, and that civil society organizations are playing a leading role. However, there are still many challenges that civil society need at this stage. One is we need more knowledge from the region. Many of our research is very much Western, and we don't look at other types of, grassroots and local production. And we look at these statements that are coming from abroad, and this is how we define them. So we need to redefine how we look at just transition. What does justice mean? And then we need more collaboration. A lot of our civil society organizations in the region work in silos. There's not a lot of interaction, or not a lot of sharing of knowledge, or sharing of also experiences. And more clarity is also needed when it comes to the movements of the region. Third is also quoting here Kanja Ahmedi, who's an activist, but also a food sovereignty expert from the region. And he identified, and I like these stories, how pre-October 2019, Lebanon civil society engagement issues related to agriculture and food has been limited to a handful number of organizations that were able to channel donors' funds and implement agriculture programs. We are in the Levant specifically very opportunistic. We look at where the funding are, Western donors, and we follow these types of donors, and specific institutions get the funding and the four agendas that are not necessarily ours, and also few institutions support and look at these types of programs and agriculture programs. So these organizations have often been politically affiliated and have not carrying a clear political discourse or advocacy for reforms. So within the 2019, if you go back to the October revolution and where we are, social movements, several agroecology food initiatives have emerged, and these initiatives have built new grassroots organizations carrying both alternative agricultural practices and a more militant agroecological discourse. And these organizations constitute a basis for a militant agroecological movement. And there's a lot of new movements that were created. Jibal is one of them, looking, and others as well, Juzuruna, Buzuruna, looking at grassroots movements. How can we empower agriculture, or even unions who work with agriculture farmers for promoting new policy and policy reforms? So it is definitely all of this. And at the moment, what I'd like to look at, I don't know how much time we have, but it's to contextualize it a bit of why are we doing this type of research, and what is also the role of different think tanks and different civil society groups in this orientation. So one is when we look at just transition. A couple of weeks ago, we were sitting with a different group, and the issue of justice is not even discussed. So when we're advocating and promoting transitions, what are we transitioning to? If we are going to phase out fossil fuel, if we are going to create these new types of jobs, who will be affected the most? We are already in an economy that is has collapsed, of course. And how can we create these new kinds of jobs, and who are going to be taking over these new jobs that we are promoting? So it is important to look at different unions. It is important to look at the research centers. It is important to look at different movements and organizations that are working also on the ground, and re-amplify their voices in this process. Another issue when we talk also about international donations and international funders, and this is also within the just transition, we look at new projects that are being implemented in the region. One of them is about green hydrogen. And this is a very critical issue, and other colleagues maybe here also can talk about it. So we're advocating for using renewable energy output and having more energy from renewable energy, and transferring these resources to Europe through transfer. And also this will be using more and more water. So it is a very critical decision. And yet we still don't know how this decision. Lebanon has signed actually an MOU with the European Union on green hydrogen. Nobody knows about it. What does it mean? How much of it is it actually fair and transparent? Who's pushing for this agenda? No one knows. We did the study actually, which you can find on our website, on green hydrogen in Tunisia. And this was a bilateral agreement between the government of Germany and the government of Tunisia. And when we published the study, first it was quite a complicated process, because we had a journalist who was investigating of how this policy was actually made public. And when the study was published, we did like a town hall, a public debate, and there were journalists, people from private sector, people living in the south of Tunisia, saying, we are already, our resources are being used at the moment, and you're asking us to have more and more layers of land being used and more energy sent to Europe, whereas we are very water insecure. And yet we still don't know how this policy was made. No one was consulted. No one from the local populations were consulted. So it is an issue of governance. And I think our role as activists, as think tank and others, is to promote and push for accountability at all levels of the government, but also it is to create solidarity amongst different institutions, among different scholars, that also redefine the concept of just transition and how much of it is also related to the politics of the region and the different movements. Maybe we'll stop here and then we can take on more questions with our colleague Hilary. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, we can discuss other questions during the discussion section after Hilary presents her PowerPoint.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon to everyone. I am Hilary from Malaysia. I'm a senior researcher with the Third World Network, and I study global environmental policy. I am now following the Just Transition Work Program at UNFCCC. I thank you, Serene, for the context, and totally this is very challenging times. I think Just Transition must be approached with deep awareness of all these global politics, country-specific contexts, indigenous people's rights, workers, and so on and so forth. Without further ado, I will share my PowerPoint, and then I will share with you what happened in the UNFCCC, especially on the Just Transition Work Program. I hope you can see my screen now. Okay. Just Transition Work Program, from COP27, they established this Just Transition Work Program. This is in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. I will just highlight a few things that was mentioned in the decision text of COP27. It notes that the global transition to low carbon emissions present opportunities and challenges for sustainable economic development and poverty eradication. Hence, the need for a just and equitable transition, which encompasses pathways that include energy, socio-economic, workforce, and other dimensions based on nationally defined development priorities and include social protection. Hence, it decides to establish a work program on just transitions and also convene an annual high-level ministerial roundtable on just transitions beginning at COP28. So this is the mandate from where the establishment of the Just Transition Work Program. This is our news update from the June intersession in Bonn this year. I will just bring you through some of the headlines that we have on our news updates. If you want to have more further readings, you can check out the articles on our website. At the start, this is the first time that countries come together to discuss. So the first headline is equity and justice must be central to just transition pathways, say developing countries. Another headline is need for broad approach to just transition pathway, say developing countries. And the last update is tough negotiations over just transitions, response measures, and global stocktake. So during the June intersessions, The Just Transitions Work Program ended with conclusions adopted together with an informal note produced by the core facilitators, capturing what was discussed, including all the contrasting views. So there is a clear divide between developed and developing countries on how they envision the Just Transition Work Program. The entire informal note is bracketed, so there is lack of consensus, and all the contrasting views were captured using a slash symbol. You can access the decision text and also the informal note on UNFCCC website. So what were discussed during June 2023? As I say, the June session saw heated debate between developed and developing countries. They discussed a few aspects on how they envision the Just Transition Work Program. The first one on overarching considerations related to the work program, objectives, scope, institutional arrangements, modalities, timelines of the work program, linkages of the Just Transition Work Program to other negotiation track, inputs, outputs, and outcomes. I will highlight a few key differences between developing countries and developed countries. In terms of scope, the developing countries want a broad scope, while developed countries call for a more narrow scope. Developing countries under G77 call for a broad scope of the work program, which take into account the needs of developing countries in relation to sustainable development, nationally defined development priorities, covering the full scope of the convention and also Paris Agreement, and also have a global dimension in which the developed countries must take the lead in demonstrating such transitions within their jurisdiction. This is as per the Article 4.4, and also support developing countries by providing means of implementations in accordance to Article 9 of Paris Agreement. This is because Just Transition Work Program is in a multilateral level. While developed countries, they call for a more narrow scope, focusing only on just transitions pathways for the workforce, as per the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which states that the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. And in terms of objective of the work program, developing countries call for the objective to be to enhance international cooperations towards securing a transition to a low carbon and climate resilient future that also contributes to reducing inequalities both within and among countries. And they regard just transitions as a key part of fully implementing the Convention, Paris Agreements, and support work that addresses the broad scope of just transitions. While developed countries, they see the objective as to unlock mitigation ambition, enabling national climate actions toward net zero emissions, and also to promote the alignment of existing domestic financial flows while ensuring there is a fiscal space to incentivize structural transformation. And this sparked the debate on what does structural transformation, fiscal space, and all this that might constrain the policy space of the developing countries. In terms of the linkages, developing countries say it is distinct from the Katowice Committee of Experts on the Impacts of Implementation of Response Measure. So this is another negotiation track which focuses more narrowly on the workforce, capacity building, and mitigation centric. So in contrast, they want the new work program addresses the wider dimensions of ensuring just transitions, taking into consideration all the dimensions, social, economic, and environmental impacts, as per the Sharm el-Sheikh decision text. Developed countries, on the other hand, they want the Katowice Committee of Experts serve as the expert body. In terms of timeline, developing countries want the work program to continue up to 2027 to fit into the second global stocktake with annual decisions. while developed countries envision the work program to be a shorter time frame, between 1 or 2 years with no annual decision. In terms of financing the just transition, developing countries call for support in the form of climate finance, technology access and transfer, capacity building. And consequently, the entire finance ecosystem is relevant. Hence, the conversations on the urgent need to transform the global financial architecture to make it fit for purpose to support sustainable development. And they do not support the reinterpretations of the Paris Agreement, including the Article 2.1c, that would purport to establish new conditionality on support for just transitions pathways. While the developed countries, especially the US, UK, and Japan, they refer to Article 2.1c, which is about making financial flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, including from the private sector, which is likely in the form of loans and often comes with conditionalities in the name of enabling environment. So the Just Transition Work Program at COP28 is an issue that can either benefit or concern developing countries, depending on how it all plays out in Dubai. The proposal by developed countries to make unlocking mitigation ambition and enabling national climate actions towards net zero emissions the objective of the work program, and at the same time, they call for deleting references to the principles of equity and CBDRRC, and to wipe out all the differentiation between developed and developing countries are problematic for developing countries. And the ultimate goal of them to wipe out their historical responsibilities toward a common and shared approach is inherently unjust. And in terms of financing for just transition pathway, there is also a risk for multilateral top-down setting and imposition of standards and frameworks which would ultimately constrain the policy space and make transitions difficult for developing countries in the name of green conditionalities and enabling environments. So in the lead up to COP28, there was a call for submission for parties and observers to submit views on all these different elements of the work program by 15 September 2023. You can access all the submissions on the UNFCCC portal. I have a picture of the Saudi Arabia on behalf of Arab Group on their submissions of the work program on just transition pathways, which is aligned to the G77 submission as well. The Secretariat will then prepare a synthesis report, but only on the parties' submissions to inform further discussions. There will be a workshop to be held before SP 59, before December 2023. The mandated workshop will further advance the discussions ahead of COP, but no date announced yet. They will also prepare a summary report on the workshop. There is also a high-level ministerial roundtable on just transition as part of the work program. Yeah, these are the thing that is with just transition work program. I think that's all from me. This will be keenly watched because of how it unfolds, especially after the workshop. We will see how the exchange of views from parties, and do check out our updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary, for this elaborate presentation. And now, Sarine, you have around 20 minutes to facilitate discussions around all these points.
Okay, thank you, Hilary. Maybe let's go back to two things around the just transition concept. First, how many of you actually have heard of just transition or have been following debates around just transition in the region, including those who are online? 1, 2, okay. Okay, 3, 4. So going back to what you also presented, Hilary, and maybe to contextualize it within the context of the region as well. So how can we use the Conference of Parties as a space to promote the just transition? When the COP now will heavily be reliant or heavily be discussing around climate finance, and specifically adaptation will be on the table, put on the table from countries such as Lebanon and other countries from the Arab bloc. So, and maybe I'd like to have few questions from the attendees as well. So how do you think at the moment are the different positions that Lebanon as a country will be facing despite the many different challenges, war, political instability, financial collapse? How can we reposition Lebanon ourselves in the context of the just transition? And are we even going through a just transition when we know that there's no accountability, lack of transparency, lack of even spaces where we debate around questions of even if we are going through a transition? So maybe a round of interventions from the speaker, Habib, and then Jula. Dani. Habib, Rula, and then Dani. تفضل حبيب.
شكرا. Thank you. Allow me first to talk a bit about just transition or transitional justice. I think that we have to go back to the definition of the concept, which was originally promoted by the West, and there are several interpretations amongst the Arab communities on how to understand this concept. It is not only about the justice that will be ensured to workers when we move from a technique to the other. Here, the concept of just transition can also encompass the resources. So with the industrial revolution, we moved from being dependent on some particular material to other material and other products. And this move was actually at the heart of the industrial revolution. And there is also the concept of justice amongst generations, because this industrial revolution that happened in the West consumed the fossil fuel for more than 200 years, and hence the impact on the climate. And while it took the nature billions of years to produce this fossil fuel. So the Western civilization consumed it in 200 years. So consumed what took millions of years for nature to produce in 200 years. And do you think that this is fair? Do you think that this is just? Besides, when we consume in less than 200 years this huge resource that is available in our nature, what are we leaving for the next generations? Where is justice? So, and where does justice stand from this? Third, transition now. From what to what? So if we are to transition, so we are required to transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. So we are required to move from a material that is subject to extinction to another similar product, because if we are to transition to renewable energy, we would need also to consume the type of soil that will help us actually produce the renewable energy. So because we need a particular soil to produce the batteries and solar panels and the windmills and all of this green energy that we are calling to transition to. So where is justice from all of this? When we talk about transition or just a transition, where is justice in that? So it's not only about justice towards the workers and where will all these people go, the question is beyond that. It is related to justice amongst generations, justice amongst the civilizations, because the scientific advance that the West has witnessed made a lot of impact. Because in the past, for example, they used to use hand tools, and then these hand tools became automatic tools or electric tools, and then automatic tools, and all of it created huge impact and catastrophic impact on our nature. And today we know that deforestation is mainly due to this very quick advancement in the equipment and tools. So talking about justice and just transition needs to take into consideration all of these dimensions, all of these aspects when we are to adopt new concepts or new ideas, and when we consider that these ideas are enough to cover a particular matter. Besides, there is also the dimension of historical responsibilities and governance. Who is responsible today? Who should assume the responsibility? So should we put the responsibility on the state or on individuals, or who should be responsible for these impacts? Would it be, for example, the companies or the entities that have been using fossil fuel and who are now calling for this transition to another kind of material? So who, or maybe is it the states that called for the transfer of technologies and that now are blaming the private sector? So all of these questions need to be raised when we discuss historical responsibilities, and all of this needs to be thought of before we bring about our demands to COP28. So we need to have answers to all these questions. Thank you, Habib. Maybe we will go back to some axes. So first, the historical responsibility, transition where to, and is there any justice in this transition, especially that we live in an area where there is no transparency, where there is no governance, where there is no accountability. And the third axis maybe is related to the private sector, which will benefit from COP28 this year. And we all know who is responsible for COP28 this year. It's the head of a company, of a private sector. So which might lead to discussions that are very similar to business as usual modality. So how can we take all this into consideration, and how can we formulate our recommendations accordingly? I'll give the floor to Rula and then to Dani. I'll switch to English, if I may.
Let me just open a parenthesis. I don't think it's fair to always refer to, I'm not saying it's you, Saline, but to the fact that COP28 is hosted by UAE, which is an oil-producing country, whereas when you know, out of the 27 COPs that have happened, 17 of them were in oil-producing countries. So I think there was an overemphasis on UAE and having Sultan Jaber being targeted in that. So just to put that parenthesis, because I think there was a lot of unfairness in that. I want to come back. I think you have highlighted excellent points, you and Hillary. What are the implications of a transition in terms of injustice, and how do we deal with that? But I would like to say that it's a continuum, and that brings the issue from changes in, as you said, job losses. Transition brings job losses. Transition brings extra resources needed. And the question is, do we have those resources? A transition brings a legal framework and a governance framework. And we ask ourselves, do we have these resources to have that sort of transition? So, and going all the way up to transition at countries, at governments and state levels. Countries, and here I would like to bring back the issue to the Gulf countries and to our region in Lebanon. We are hoping to be an oil-producing country, oil and gas-producing country. What does that mean in terms of having to address this transition? What are the expenses that will be incurred on the government, on the status apparatus? And it needs really a reform process that is time-consuming, that is resource-consuming, and that has the knowledge and the capacity that is not really there yet. When we speak about green jobs versus brown jobs, we remember when the discussion was about green economy and greening the brown, or growing the green or greening the brown. All this has implication in terms of jobs. But then again, I don't think we have, to my knowledge yet, a standardized and systematic approach to really assessing where are the losses and where are the gains. And when you speak about losses and gains, not just at an aggregate level, but also at a disaggregate level, how young versus elderly, rural versus urban sectors, AI sectors versus agriculture sectors. There are all these معطيات يعني معطيات يلي factors that will help, that need to be there when we speak about a just transition, but also estimate time, resource, and capacity for addressing a justice transition to a justice system. Otherwise, it will remain broad titles with very and it will be washed away as it is. And we have a lot to talk about who is steering the negotiation process, how well are we, and this is really something very important for Lebanon, and what the research community, the civil society, the different non-state actors have a lot to contribute, so that they equip the negotiators with good material to negotiate on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rula. I think these are very good points. We'll definitely come back. We'll give the floor to Danny, and then we can have another round as well.
My name is Danny from Head Organization. I believe that most of the points were already covered. I would only like to highlight the 2 points: intergenerational justice. And I would like to consider this from an education point of view, and to ask to which extent our schools and our universities are ready to accompany this transition. So are we ready to equip cadre and to equip our individuals to follow up on and to accompany this transition? And another point, transition from where to where, as Mr. Habib was saying. And I think that if we think about energy transition in the world, we see a transition to a perceived greener level. However, in our area of the world, we are still far from the basic level. So we still don't have energy in order to consider transitioning to another energy level. So today, it is very difficult for us to convince people and to teach people about the good practices, whether with the solar energy or other. So this is very difficult, and we are facing a lot of challenges, and we still need to convince the people and the citizens how can they be partners in this. Thank you, Danny. So yes, you spoke about solar panels, you spoke about private companies and the random transition of people to this solar panel, while in most of our areas, we don't have electricity to start with. And this brings us back to the equity question. So to see who can pay for the solar panel. People don't have the knowledge about solar panels, how they can recharge the batteries, how much will these batteries last, where should I get the batteries and the panels, etc. So people are not aware of their rights, they don't have the basic knowledge. So today, when we think about just transition, we also need to think about knowledge. How is this knowledge conveyed? Who is transferring the knowledge to whom? We have to think about equity. Are people equal in this just transition? Is it fair? Do we have justice? Where are we transitioning to? Who is mostly affected? So we know that in societies like Lebanon, there are categories and groups whose voices are never heard, like the refugees and others. So if we are to think about justice in general, not only in Lebanon, we also have to think about Lebanon's position towards the international community and the donors. So today we know who is mostly funding the climate projects in Lebanon. Lately, in the last 10 years, we have received maybe $5 to $8 billion, and most of this money went to or was given to research centers or to few companies and organizations to implement a few adaptation projects. So what does that mean? What can we do with $8 billion? Can we achieve progress? Rula, please. I would like to add that when we talk about justice, and exactly as you said, what are we getting in terms of finance? So, and I believe that finance is a pillar portfolio when we talk about transition, and a pillar portfolio in the climate negotiations. So today we know that most of the financement is allocated to mitigation, while we know that our region and Lebanon needs money for adaptation. And this financing is given as loans, is provided as loans and not as grants. So, and this is purely lack of justice. So when your needs are somewhere and the donor interests are elsewhere. So this should be at the heart of our case when we want to address just transition. Zaina, please. And then we give the floor to Hillary. Zaina, please. Zaina is not using the microphone. Please, we kindly ask Zaina to use the microphone. Based on what has been said, Rola spoke about the policy level. So whether in Lebanon or other countries that are in similar situation as Lebanon, or maybe countries like and regions like Gaza. So she spoke about the policy level, and then she mentioned the international level. So at the international level, we have to discuss or to think about the resources. And we also have another level, which we often forget, which is the grassroots level. So here, what are the standards of justice? Who decides who can install solar panels on their buildings? What about the buildings that are in the city? So do we have the capacity to install solar panels on all our buildings? I have read a study that said that in some cities in Europe, if you put together all of the surfaces of all of the buildings together, you wouldn't have enough space to install solar panels that would provide enough energy for everyone. So how about a country that lacks all the legal and legislative frameworks, and with the lack of all the of any institution that is capable of actually handling all these matters? So I don't think that it's the job of NGOs to replace the state in legislations, in policy making, and in advocating with the international community. So with the lack of all these institutions, how can we think about just transition? So I just wanted to try and link between all of the ideas that were presented, especially that we cannot focus only on one single level. So we have to have a holistic approach, especially if we're talking about a country like Lebanon. Thank you, Zaina. I will go back to Hillary, maybe to answer the questions that were raised or to respond to some observations. Hillary, please.
بنبلش هيلاري وبعدين هلا.
Thank you. All the discussions that you guys are having is the same that we are having in Malaysia, I think in every country as well. I actually saw another hand raised. I will be quick, and then I'll so that we have space for one. I think the most important thing is to recognize that there are global and national and local level, like the dimension, there are different dimensions to just transitions. And hence the holistic framework of key principles addressing energy poverty from critical minerals, because critical minerals is needed if we want to transition to renewable energies. So it needs a more holistic approach when we talk about just transition these days. And so also context specific in the country specific. And I think the last point that I want to leave is really to uphold the people power and human rights through just transitions. I'll end there because this is a good start of the discussions when we talk about just transitions. Yeah, I'll just end there so that we can have space for Hala, I think. I'll pass back to you, Serene. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hillary. We'll give the floor to Hala and then another round. هلا عم تسمعينا؟ إذا فيك تعملي المداخلة.
Can you hear us, Hala? Hello, Serene. My name is Hala Murad from Jordan. Allow me, first of all, to say that we are highlighting the Lebanese case in specific, and we are trying to adopt a regional approach to this dialogue. I'd like to give you an example. In Jordan, several positive measures were taken in just the transition. All the governments have transitioned to renewable energy by 28 to 30%. However, what I'd like to say is that as local grassroots organizations working on the national level, we tend to realize and to monitor the violations, especially human rights violations that could occur during the implementation of just transition programs, such as using agricultural lands to establish a renewable energy plan or a plant or a renewable energy plant that exceeds 4 megawatts in residential areas. It is not sufficient to focus on the use of citizen bases. A lot of studies confirm how dangerous it is to use renewable energy plants inside the cities due to heat islands and changing the environment surrounding people within cities or the continuous maintenance activities and the use of expensive amounts of water in order to clean solar panels in a country that suffers from water scarcity. All these conditions are often not studied when we talk about just a transition. We do not understand how just transition affects people's lives. We are only considering the long-term impacts, such as the reduction of emissions. Mr. Habib also said, are we in fact reducing global pollution, or are we going to use and reuse these batteries, these solar panels? On the long term, are we going to reuse them or to throw them away? All of these are questions that we have to ask, and we need to agree that we need to use these energies and we need to understand the problematics and the issues and how they affect people's lives. This remains largely not studied in the Arab world. In our organization, we submitted a complaint against a UN-led project, and we stopped the project because it was developed in an urban region in a city. Transition needs to be in line with our capabilities and to ensure that the government is capable of making its own decisions.
Thank you everyone so much. For the sake of timekeeping, we will have to move on to our next section. We welcome Mr. Vicente Paulo Yu, who just joined us. Excuse me.
بس to answer ما هيك
لأنه he can only join us till 4 p.m. هلا later in the end we will have some space for key takeaways and remarks.
Yes,
for briefly, please.
Very recommendation. What do we want out of this session? لأنه زينة سألت يعني it's a very valid question يلي هي
What do we want? As Zaina said, what is the role of civil society? I believe that there are 3 key points. 1, negotiators. So she will speak in English.
First point is extending the time span for the transition. We really need to look into that. It's not pushing for a transition. If we want a just transition, we need to extend the lifespan. The second point is mapping and analyzing the impact of the transition on different sectors, population, as I said, at a disaggregate level. And then the third point is identifying the resources needed for this just transition. And I think these are, I personally, I don't see a way out of renewable energy. Even if we can say all what we want to say about the the incapacity of renewable energy to be an alternative. But I don't think, Habib, we can put it aside. The whole world is moving in this direction. What we need is really to look at how do we want to compensate, to be compensated, and how can we extend the lifespan of this transition so that we can adjust. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I know there's
Let's
a lot
take
of
2 minutes to wrap up because there was
share.
an interesting comment. لا تفضل.
I talked about the concept and how it is being marketed. So I have one conclusion. We do not have to adopt the just transition concept. We need to request a different model that is less energy heavy. We're moving from fossil fuel to renewable energy that requires rare soil. There are historical responsibilities that should be borne by the model that got us to this place. We need to be less energy consuming, and that there is an alternative. The only alternative to fossil fuel is nuclear energy, given the amounts that we are consuming in energy, in production, in heating, etc. Nothing compensates if we want to be clear and honest. And I think that the nuclear energy threatens human beings and our life. So we need a model that we need, not an environment-friendly model. We need to reconsider this slogan, energy transition. We need to move to a new modern model that consumes less energy. We need to conclude this session.
I mean, everyone, thank you so much, and Hilary for the intervention. But I will add into the just transition, the issue that we are in a region that has been heavily going through wars and wars of so many, many years. And we cannot deny the fact of the occupation is still here. We still have wars and still have a large displacement happening in our region from one internally and even externally. And this is a time where, when we talk about this transition, it is important to look at the most impacted, and also to going back to our sovereignty. سيادتنا والموارد اللي عنا إياها. And we are very much opportunistic. And when we talk about the Levant, I mean, there's not a Levant and North Africa. It's different than the Gulf. We are very much opportunistic. If there is funding available, we would go for it without thinking on the long term, this is going to affect our land, this is going to affect our water, and this is going to affect our ecosystem, and public health as well, and our population. So it's very important to look at it from this perspective, and that justice today is not the same as justice before. Justice is also internally within our own countries, and having mechanisms of accountability, a judicial system that is independent as well, and at the same time also to going back to international donors, international community, and say that you have been for all these years supporting these international projects and continuing on supporting these unsustainable also growth, and looking back at how we need to reflect as, are we going into the right direction? And this continuous growth has to stop at some point. So yeah, thank you, Hilary, for the intervention. We leave the floor back at you. Thank you. شكرا للجميع.
Thank you, everyone. So now I would like to welcome Mr. Wael Gamal and Mr. Vicente Paulo Yu, who will be joining us for the next section around climate finance. The floor is yours.
مساء الخير.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Wael Kamal, and I am a researcher and the director of economic and social justice organization in Egypt. We also have been working on this matter for several years. I thank you for extending this invitation and for allowing me the ability to address you. I think that these sessions and what I am going to personally discuss are going to be quite similar, and I would like to apologize if I am not focused because I've recently had COVID and I haven't properly recovered yet. One of the donors or one of the speakers said yesterday that financing is the entry point to everything, and I completely and radically disagree with what he said because I believe that quantifying everything that is related to people's lives and then talking about the resources that might be available to conduct business as usual, and then talk about a crisis of financing, and then choose from the different options that are available to us what is convenient. We often tend to believe or to consider what is more fruitful, what is more beneficial, what should be invested in, depending on the agendas of the different donors. This is a wrong approach, and we need to put an end to this method of thinking. This is a matter of existence, and it is an opportunity to deal with an economic and social model that is broken, that is outdated, and that keeps falling into a new crisis. The current model, COP27, is not, the current model is not working. COP27 came to important conclusions. However, they were not addressed since then, as if we are decidedly making no effort in order to find solutions. The loss and damage was mentioned in the Aswan meeting. However, it was not yet addressed, and it does not even address the differences between developing and developed countries. Among the most important aspects of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh was to reconsider the structure of international finance organizations. This constituted an important step, in my opinion. However, its execution remains different. It pointed to a structural issue in how these international institutions are established. A lot of organizations are calling for the introduction of the loss and damage fund in the current model. However, it is not in line with the people's interests in just transition. Therefore, it is important to reconsider the nature of the economic and social system and the social disparities within and among countries. Otherwise, we will not be able to deal with an urgent situation such as the climate change without addressing these structural issues. Therefore, I think that it is important to celebrate the small wins. However, choosing UAE to host COP28 has been predetermined. However, it is symbolic And choosing the UAE also came from an oil company. And this is something that has to be taken into account because they announced primarily when they chose the UAE that they will support the interests of these companies. In Sharm el-Sheikh, the largest number of representatives of fossil fuel companies were in attendance, and please correct me if I'm wrong, investment funds were in attendance because they were trying to reach agreements at the expense of the climate, and we need to take all of these into account without diminishing their importance. We are not here to say that the efforts or tactical efforts are not sufficient. However, it is very important to maintain progress between so according to the latest studies, climate change costs $16 million per hour over 17 years, and these are enormous direct losses. Another leading study published in Nature this year for Andrew Fanning and Jason Hickel on the cost of pollution over the last few decades. These two researchers were capable of estimating the cost at more than 100 trillion US dollars. Of course, this is an enormous number, and the capacities and resources available do not go in line with the availability of funds, because the funds do not, or the money does not grow on trees. They come from banks, and banks are capable of supporting. The United States, 1 week prior to the Israeli war against Gaza, had asked the Congress for a package to provide support for Ukraine and Israel, $105 million. And we have been talking about $100 billion by 2025, most of which will be allocated to developing models that are not supportive of the developing countries. Without further ado, I think that with regards to the COP and to financing, there are two main issues that we have to look into in line with, or in cooperation with developing countries and relevant social movements. One, debts, and this is another a struggle. The different forms of financing, we need to be free of them in order to actually serve the cause of social justice and to support the most at risk persons instead of guaranteeing more wins, more profits for the creditors and the provision of new financial instruments. I would like to quickly talk about just transition, and I completely agree with what Sareen said in the beginning. What is produced in the Arab world and in the South on climate change is weak and needs to be reinforced. We need to develop our own narrative that is emanating from people's interests and our position in the world. Just a transition is one of the concepts that we can benefit from because it emanates from a social movement, which was in the beginning a labor movement. It was adopted by different social movements. And during the Amsterdam summit in 2019, the model is similar to what Mr. Habib was defending. There are 6 principles for just transition. It differs based on the classes, on the people's impact. It is a gendered issue that affects women differently from men, and 4, it should include specific and a clear action plan. This is not merely environment related matter. It also addresses the development model that should be adopted throughout the world and the matter of democracy, in addition to the participation in deciding what is fair from what is not. This is a key. It is a key requirement, and thank you for your attention, and I apologize if I took too long.
Shukran and masal khair, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here for Third World Network to be part of the conversation that you have. I think what I would like to do, and then I fully agree with what Wael earlier stated in terms of the kind of issues that we are facing when it comes to talking about climate finance. So what I would like to do in my presentation is sort of provide us with an overview of where climate finance issues are going into COP28, and then also link that into the second part of what I was supposed to talk about this afternoon, the global stock take, because that is a key part of it. The problem, the issue, the reason why I am trying to sort of like put things together is so that we have a clear idea of sort of like the interlinkages of the finance issues that we will be facing at COP28, and how from our perspective of those of us who are involved in the negotiations, these might get discussed in the context of the negotiations. So let me share my screen quickly, and then I can go straight into my presentation. Let me just highlight this. Is it now on the slideshow mode? Can you see it? Yeah, thank you. So I'll do the presentation in 2 parts. One on climate finance and loss and damage finance, and then the next presentation will be on GST. So let me just go very quickly through sort of like the framing in terms of how developing countries look at climate finance, and that is from the perspective that climate finance is in fact an obligation, something that was agreed to by all countries that are under the convention back in 1992. I've listed down some of the key provisions of the Climate Change Convention that are there, and it is also reflected in the Paris Agreement. So essentially, what the Convention and the Paris Agreement do together is they clearly identify developed countries as the primary source of climate finance to assist developing countries in undertaking mitigation, adaptation, and other actions that are relevant to implementing both the Paris Agreement and the Climate Change Convention. The developed countries now, unfortunately, have a different idea, and I think Wael mentioned this a bit earlier. The idea is that their idea now is that climate finance is not necessarily an obligation for them, but it's something that now fits into what they called in Article 2.1c framework, which is that it's part and parcel of this broader finance flows being consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And in that way, start talking about an expansion of who should be paying into climate finance. And then I think that is one of those big political issues that we are facing now in the climate convention, which, for example, is clearly seen in many of these specific topics, specific issues that often make the climate negotiations so complicated. For example, we talk about climate finance definitions. A lot of these is about how do you compute and calculate how much climate finance you are providing. And part of the problem there is that many developed countries do not want to have any clear climate finance definition because they want to be able to define what climate finance is according to how they think it should be. And one of the ways in which that has really come out, to the foreground recently is when the United Kingdom recently changed the definition of climate finance. So there's also this issue of sources of finance, between public versus private. All of us developing countries are essentially saying that it is public grants coming from public sources, taxpayers' money of developed countries because it's a governmental state obligation, and developed countries coming in and saying that it is about private sector financing. And so you have all of these things that I've listed down in the slide about instruments, whether it's grants or loans, how much should it be, how do you reflect into climate finance the recognition of the needs of developing countries, access to climate finance, and the balance between funding and all that. So there are big political issues that are coming up for COP28 that I think should be aware of. And a big part of that really is sort of like this kind of narrative, this changing of the narrative that we are seeing in developed countries, where they essentially say, we all got to do something, and essentially there's increasingly pointing the finger at developing countries, even if developing countries historically have contributed the least to climate finance. So again, going to COP28, Article 2.1c will be one of those big issues that we are fighting. There is this ongoing negotiations and setting a new finance goal. They call it the collective quantified goal on finance. There are issues about reporting to talk about both definitions, what kind of information should be provided, issues about making sure that climate finance is not in the form of debt, and this whole issue of are we now at the phase in the climate finance negotiations where developed countries are now much more upfront, much more aggressive in terms of saying that they don't want to take the lead anymore, that they want the entire burden of undertaking climate action to be done by developing countries, especially especially the middle income ones, like those that are in the Arab region and in Asia and Latin America. On the argument that most of the emissions are going to be coming from the developing countries, so that is one of those big issues, and you're seeing this in the way that the international climate finance architecture is being shaped. You have different kinds of course, financing funds that have been developed over the past few years with very little funding in them. For example, the Green Climate Fund, set up in 2012, it's supposed to do all of these things, support a paradigm shift, provide balanced treatment between mitigation and adaptation, and other things. Unfortunately, it does not have a lot of money. So far, over the almost 15 years that it has been in existence, the 10 years or so it has been in existence, very little amount so far, barely $10 billion, considering the scale of, according to what many scientists have been saying, the scale of the need developing countries for climate finance. Again, the GCF is a microcosm of the UNCCC. In the GCF, you have a much more focused argument over who should be contributing. What should climate finance be? Is it about grants or about loans? Who should be eligible? Many developing countries are raising issues about eligibility because it becomes very highly political. And so, for example, countries under sanctions, like some in the Arab region, Syria, Iran, Iraq, other countries which are not in favor with the West often find it very difficult to get grants from the Green Climate Fund. And so you have all of those fights that sort of like get mixed up in terms of what climate finance is about, right? And it's not as if there is no money available. I mean, there are funding. The EU had was easily able to find billions for their pandemic recovery package. You have fossil fuel subsidies that could be redirected after the 2008 financial crisis and the pandemic. You had bailouts that were given. You have announcements of green deals in the US. Billions, hundreds of billions for the Inflation Reduction Act. In the EU, you have the Green New Deal. And don't forget, we also have all of those hundreds of billions that are easily generated when they want to, in order to fund the military, for wars, for occupation, for invasions, like what we're now seeing in your region. So there is money available. It's just that it's not directed in the proper way. And so these are the things that we really need to keep track of when we go to COP28. And that is going to be part and parcel, this broader finance picture of this whole loss and damage finance issue. That we, for example, recently met on in Aswan, and we'll be meeting on again in Abu Dhabi in a few days. Loss and damage really is about financing to support countries respond to the adverse effects of climate change. It's beyond adaptation. And it is something that we have been trying to develop for a long time. Developing countries first raised the loss and damage finance idea back in 1992. But the institutional architecture for loss and damage we really started developing only since 2013. And Sharm el-Sheikh last year was crucial in terms of establishing the loss and damage fund. And this year has been a year of both frustration and hopefully optimism in terms of setting that, of finally operationalizing that. So loss and damage, both the institutional architecture and the funding is now part of the climate regime. It's just a question of how do we operationalize it? And this is now where we are. This sort of like triangle model of loss and damage in the climate change architecture. We've set it up. We have a policy body. We have a technical assistance arm, and we're now just trying to figure out what to do with loss and damage finance. And hopefully we get it in Dubai this year. But it's very difficult for the moment because there are big questions for which we do not have answers yet coming from the transitional committee. And this reflects big fights as well between developed and developing countries. Questions about who governs it, who would be contributing to it, who would be eligible to get funding from it, what is it supposed to be for, how much it would be, and how do you access it? All of these are questions that are still being negotiated. We did not conclude in Aswan. It will be negotiated again in Abu Dhabi in the beginning of November, and hopefully agreed on finally in Dubai at COP28. So there are many areas that need to be shaped for the loss and damage fund. These are among the things that I have highlighted in slide that our colleagues in the transitional committee will be really looking at to develop. So loss and damage finance together with the broader climate finance picture are one of those things that we expect to see going into the global stocktake. And because the global stocktake is not just about taking a broad look at what we have done so far as a global community, but it's really looking at all of the issues in a balanced way, and it's something that the G77 and China, the developing countries, have put forward. It's looking at things in a balanced way so that you're able to talk about the things that need to be undertaken on mitigation and adaptation, on response measures, on just transition, on loss and damage, and fitting that in with finance and technology transfer and capacity building. So these are some of the issues that are going to come up at the global stocktake in Dubai. So collective progress, equity, opportunities and challenges, and the lessons learned, as well as the political messages. And the process is going to be like this. We have finished this one. The information inputs, we've done the technical assessment. The technical dialogue has produced their output. And so now we're going into the political phase where we will be negotiating what the messages are, what the things are that the COP would like countries to do collectively, moving towards 2025. So the outcomes is something that for developing countries we have been highlighting. Equity is important, integrated and holistic treatment of everything. We need to look at the gaps pre-2020. So where have countries failed, especially developed countries failed in terms of doing mitigation and providing finance and technology transfer, and then looking at how it could be undertaken after 2025, climate actions, so that you have a systemic and transformational change going into 2025 and afterwards. So the developing countries in the G77 have essentially identified many of these things already, so I'm not going to focus on that. But I think the key thing that we have to look at in the global stocktake is that for countries, for governments that are engaged in it, it is not about pointing fingers. It's about highlighting a non-prescriptive assessment of collective efforts, and then highlighting how you can build in fairness into the climate regime afterwards. And so, of course, for developing countries, fairness is really a reflection of equity. It's a reflection of climate finance being operationalized. It's a reflection of loss and damage finance being operationalized as well. And other things are being done that need to be done to support developing countries. Not repeat, not do the mistakes that developed countries did when they were developing. So maybe let me just then focus on this last 4 points. One, for many developing countries, the outcome of the GST, the global stocktake, should be one that is a message that talks about sustainable development and economic diversification, that looks at just transitions, looking at systemic transformational change. We create a link between what happened in the past, the failures of the past, and looking at opportunities that can be undertaken in the future, and then looking at how international cooperation could be enhanced, so that you don't talk about competition, but you talk about cooperation. You don't talk about unilateral measures, but you talk about multilateral measures. No, you avoid unilateral barriers or sanctions, and you focus instead on working together as a global community. Whether we are able to do that, I do not know. We will definitely try as the G77, as colleagues working in the negotiations, and your ideas and suggestions on how we could do that would be very useful. So maybe let me end here, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you very much. Shukran. Thank you for those two questions. I think they're actually very complex questions because those are things that we are struggling over. One, in terms of, would we be able to convince developed countries to increase funding? My feeling is that I think it's going to be extremely difficult in this situation. But the point is that there is money available, right? And the question is, and I think how we build a narrative to make sure that the fact that there is money available for different things, not just for climate action, unfortunately though not for climate action, is something that I think we all need to do. The difficulty, however, that I am noticing in many of the developed country counterparts, or at least the governments that they represent, is that many of them also see climate action now as very low down in terms of their priorities. There are other priorities. Some of their governments are shifted to the right, and climate change is not one of those things that they want to fund. They want to fund anti-immigration programs. They want to fund invasions and wars and other things, right? So the situation when it comes to new climate finance, or when it comes to this new collective quantified goal, is part of the complexity lies in that sort of like background that we see in many developed countries. Another complexity there, of course, is the fact that many of these developed countries are now also starting to point fingers at what they call rich developed countries or big developing countries. And then they want those to be treated in the same way as smaller developing countries, which, of course, these other developing countries are saying no to, because then that completely changes the framework of international cooperation that they had all agreed under the Convention of the Paris Agreement. So I think it's a big political issue, likely not resolvable. We cannot resolve this. We will not be able to resolve it at COP28. That issue is going to hit the front burner next year when you talk about the new collective quantified goal. And I think for that, we need to prepare our narrative. On the loss and damage fund, and whether it will sort of like suck money away from existing climate finance streams, admittedly, that is a real opportunity. That is a real risk that we have to face. But I think we are also, as developing countries, we are saying that this is new and additional. And so the challenge is to make sure that you have reporting and guidance and accounting modalities in the Climate Convention and the Paris Agreement process that actually allows us to track whether they are diverting that money and then call them to account. Right now, we do not have that. And so it's one of those many things that we have to juggle in the context of the negotiations. But I think the clear call for developing countries is that this is new and additional for loss and damage finance, not something that you take from mitigation, not something that you take from adaptation, but something that is new on its own. Of course, developed countries, though, are saying no to that. They want to be flexible. They want to have flexibility in terms of where they get the money from. So it's going to be a big, complex political fight, when we go to COP28. I cannot hear the question.
So a question by Hala. I have a simple question about the rule. What is the rule or the standards that will be followed by those who are those who will be in charge of the global stock taking? I remember when we attended the COP27, there were attendees like the EU and USA and other states who had several scenarios regarding the mitigation levels that they will reach. So at the beginning, they set it to 30% by 2030, and then they raised it to 46% in some countries. And the EU raised it to 60%. Like in Germany, for example. So several stakeholders had the different expectations after the Paris Agreement. How did it go until now? And for us, for those who are following closely this matter, it is still unclear what is the baseline and what are the standards that will be used in the global stock taking, and on which basis this assessment will be done in order to measure or to assess the commitments of these countries as well as the developing countries. So I believe that there is still some ambiguity in here. We still don't know what is the baseline and what are the standards. I had also another question. Maybe you have already answered this question in your intervention, but I want to be sure. We very often say $100 billion, $100 billion whenever we want to talk about climate funding. But we know that the $100 billion was a pledge for mitigation and mitigation by 2020. However, the amount was not ensured by 2020, and this was postponed to other years. And today, when we talk about the loss and damage fund, are we still talking about the same 100 billion amount, or are we talking about new vision and an additional $100 billion? So here again, there is some kind of confusion. Are we talking about the same 100 billion, or are we talking about another 100 billion? I know you said in your intervention that the funding of the nourishing of the fund should not be taken out of other streams, but every time we hear the same amount. So we need clarification around that. And thank you for your intervention.
Shukran, Hala, for those two questions. Let me take the second one first. The idea of the loss and damage fund is that this is a new fund. I think developing countries had proposed earlier this year something like 200 billion, I think, as the loss and damage fund. Of course, developed countries are against that. They do not want any specific amount to be identified as being the target amount for the loss and damage fund. So that is one of those key issues that we'll be fighting over. So this is separate from the existing 100 billion climate finance commitment that developed countries have until 2025. So as you rightly said, they pledged back in Cancun in 2010, $100 billion in the context of meaningful, they call it meaningful mitigation action and transparency, that 100 billion would be reached per year by 2020. They did not do that. Up to now, 2023, they still haven't met it. But their current commitment between 2021 to 2025 is to provide at least $100 billion a year for climate finance for both mitigation and adaptation together. So loss and damage is separate from that. Whether that 100 billion for broader climate finance stays or gets increased depends on what the negotiations of the on this new collective quantified goal will look like next year. And so we're hoping that it would be increased, but then there will be a big fight over who should be paying into that fund. And same way that there is now a fight over who should be paying into the loss and damage fund. So there are two separate pots of money, if you will, but it's overall, this part of this broader climate finance package that we are hoping we could get as developing countries. Now, on the first question on the baseline or targets, if you will, that developed countries are looking for in the global stocktake and mitigation, My sense is that they are looking to see the use of sorry, I'm in a hotel lobby, so there's music behind me. I think they're looking to see using some of the IPCC language about a global mitigation target. I think it's about 60% below 2010 levels by the year 2030, and then going to somewhere around net zero by 2050. That's their target to be put into the global stocktake mitigation section. But it is something to be still negotiated. um, part of the con- part of the complexity is that they are hedging their bets, so they're doing that push in the global stocktake, while at the same time they're also doing another push to have more stringent targets globally in the mitigation work program. What we do not know, and what we do not know is how they would link that mitigation target to, for example, other actions that they are supposed to take, like increasing, reporting on public finance, climate finance, and all that. So developing countries are trying to tie all of these things together so that if we have to have a global mitigation target through the global stocktake or through the mitigation work program, that has to be linked to an increase, for example, in climate finance targets and loss and damage finance targets and adaptation finance targets, as well as technology transfer. So that will be sort of like this kind of package that will be the core of the negotiations going into Dubai, and then after Dubai, going into the next few years. But finally, I think one final point I want to add there is that a lot of these things will become much more highlighted next year after the global stocktake is finished this year, because next year is when developed and developing countries are supposed to put in their new NDCs, their new national climate action plans. And I know that many of the developed countries are now approaching, in fact, many developing countries to provide them with offers of funding to help write their new set of NDCs. And I would not be surprised if in those new sets of NDCs they would put in higher national mitigation targets, even if one, there is no just transition, even if there's no financing, even if there's no technology transfer and other things. So it's very complex, but you have all of these moving parts, sort of like moving around together, and we have to be very careful about all of those things. Thank you. Well, that is what we are trying to do as developing countries. When you talk about this global goal on adaptation framework, one of those sort of like things that we want to quantify as part of that goal is a finance goal for adaptation. Developing countries, of course, are pushing back on it. They're saying that the global goal on adaptation in the Paris Agreement is simply aspirational. So we are trying to link it. The developed countries are trying to push away from it. On the first question that you had, I'm not sure about. I mean, what one could say is that for both COP28 and after COP28, you will have increasingly a lot of many of these like bilateral partnerships that many developed countries are going to go into, or most likely will go into, in terms of providing finance streams. They will say they want to do that, and then they will flag that as part of their climate finance issue. But the question then is, how do we account for that as being part of this broader climate finance package? And this really goes into the question of reporting and transparency and accountability. Potentially a set of initiatives that could become more prominent over next year, couple of years, would be this joint energy transition partnerships. We're seeing this with that we saw with South Africa, with Indonesia. They might go into that and use that as a way to sort of like diminish the push for this new collective quantified goal on climate finance. But at the same time, because next year is going to be the climate finance goal discussion, finally, then that's one of the things that we will have to watch out for. So what I'm not sure is whether there will be new funding available. Shukran. Thank you.
Welcome back everyone. فهلأ رح نفتح المجال إذا في أي key messages حابين تشاركونا فيهم قبل ما نختتم اجتماعنا. تفضل.
بالإضافة للمحاور اللي تم اقتراحها والتداول فيها بهاليومين، بتصور إذا نحن يعني بدنا نتوجه بتوصياتنا، خلينا نحدد يعني مين بدنا نتوجه فيهم. نتوجه فيهم للمفوضين العرب، نحن عم نحكي عن القضايا الملحة بالمنطقة العربية، يعني نحن مبدئيا المفروض نوجهها للمفوضين العرب بالنتيجة بشكل أو بآخر، مش هيك؟ سواء كان المفوضين العرب هن المفوضين اللي بيفوضوا فعلا، او هن الحكومات، او هن الوزارات المعنيه الى ما هنالك، يعني نفس الرساله. وتصور انه كمان كنت اكيد رح يكون في ترجمه لهالنص، يكون كمان للمنظمات غير الحكوميه العالميه كمان اللي نحن متشارك معها
رح يترجم.
يعني هيك المفروض يكون العين بتروح التوصيات وخلاصه اجتماعنا. بحب انه نضاف للمحاور الاساسيه اللي حكينا عنها: التخفيف، التمويل، الخسائر والاضرار والى ما هنالك، والتقييم. شيء بيتعلق شوي كمان بالنسبه للمفوضين العرب بموضوع نقل التكنولوجيا، واللي هو نحن يعني مطلب تراجعت عنه المفوضين البلدان الناميه ومن ضمنهم المجموعه العربيه، انه ما عادوا حكيوا فيه لناحيه إخراج الطاقة المتجددة والتكنولوجيا المتجددة أو التكنولوجيا الخضراء من دوائر منظمة التجارة العالمية، ومن قبضة قوانين حماية الملكية الفكرية لهذه الاختراعات المتعلقة فيها. يجب إعادة التفاوض بهذا الموضوع، لأنه بطلوا يتفاوضوا في البلدان النامية. فهذا أحد المطالب الأساسية. بالإضافة لذلك طبعا موضوع الخسائر والأضرار في له أبعاد كثيرة، وفي يعني موقف اللي يتاخذ من ناحية وين بده يكون موقع الصندوق. كان الصندوق النقد الدولي كيف لازم ياخذ توصية فيها إنه ما يكون عند الصندوق النقد الدولي هذا الموضوع، وتحديد مين الجهات اللي لازم تستفيد منه، وكيف بدنا نحمل مسؤولياته على أي أساس، وإذا كان في ضرورة إنه يعني بالاتفاقية يصير في تعديلات أو لا، واللي زميلتي بعد ما موافقة كثير معي فيه. لازم يكون في عندنا موقف من الحروب بهالاعلان اللي بدنا نطلعه بالاخر، انه هاي الحروب اكيد رح يكون موضوع التمويل في عجز كبير فيه كثير. انا هيك بتوقع هذه السنه بسبب الحروب، لانه رح يروحوا البلدان اللي عليها انه تمول المناخ هي ذاتها هلا عم تمول الحروب. وهيدا بعتقد لازم يكون في اشاره كثير قويه، ولازم تكون باول البيان تبعنا
صح.
هالاشاره موجوده. في عنا العرب هالمره مركزين انه يحطوا موضوع سحب الكربون وتخزينه كنقطة أساسية على جدول الأعمال، طالما أنه يعني قيادة العربية الآن من الدول النفطية هي عم تدير المفاوضات العربية. نحن كمجتمع مدني ما بنشوف هذا الموضوع يعني أولوية، وما بنشوفه أنه هو يعني بمثابة تعويض عن شيء اللي لازم نعمله بمحل تاني. يعني الصرف اللي بدك تدفعه على البلدان الغنية النفطية على تخزين الكربون فيها تدفعه أكثر بعتقد على التخفيف للبلدان النامية. على أي بالمنطقة العربية بتصور في أجدى، لأنه هداك كتير مكلف ومش مضمون النتائج، فبتصور لازم ياخذ موقف كمان منه. موضوع كمان تجارة الكربون كمان ناشطين كتير فيه وبلشوا يشتغلوا. عاملين كان اجتماع بالسعودية من جمعتين ثلاثة على أنه بده يقدموا شوية أفكار حول تجارة الكربون وسوق الكربون والى ما هنالك. كمان هالموضوع بتصور انا بده يعني اعاده نظر منا، انه كمان ما نكون نحن كثير متحمسين له. بالاضافه لذلك نحن ممكن نطلع بمبادره. كنت عم بحكي هلا شوي مع زملائي هون انه نحن يكون عندنا مبادره انه نحن نطالب انه يعتمد العالم على النظام الغذائي المتوسطي القديم اللي كان يعتمد على اللحم اقل، يعني كان ياكلوا فيه النحم بالمناسبات. فاذا هذا النموذج بصير عالمي ونقترحه بهالمفاوضات انه نحن من كدول المنطقه كمجتمع مدني نقترح انه العوده الى هذا النظام اللي هو فيه لحم اقل، بتصور انا بنكون عم خفف 20 30% من الانبعاثات العالميه اللي هي مصدرها غاز الميثان اللي قائم على تربيه الحيوانات والتربيه الحيوانيه، واللي عم يقطعوا بسببها الغابات تيزرعوا الاعلاف الحيوانيه والى ما هنالك. بالاضافه للداش الثروه الحيوانيه بتؤدي الى يعني استهلاك غابات واستهلاك وانتاج غاز الميثان اللي هو اخطر ب 32 مره من غاز ثاني اكسيد الكربون على المناخ. بتصور هذه يعني باقه من الاقتراحات الختاميه. بالاضافه طبعا بدي احكي رايي بالاشياء اللي عم بحكي شيء غير اللي حكينا فيه. يعني هلا بالاشياء حكينا فيها عندنا شويه ملاحظات بترك لغيري الكلام.
هلا يعني هيدي بدها ديبيت، خاصة أنا لا بوافق يلي عم بيقولوا حبيب. يعني النقاط مهمة. يمكن الوحيدة موضوع تخزين الكربون. يعني بلاقي إنه نحن بدنا ناخد قضايا جامعة بين الدول المنطقة. ما رح هلا الغرب ضد فكرة تخزين الكربون وما بيعتبروها انه هيدي كلين انرجي، ولكن اليوم بدك تدعم دول يلي نرجع بنحكي بالجاست ترانزيشن انه يقدروا يتأقلموا مع المتغيرات بشكل يلي ما بيغير له ما بيضرهم to a large extent. هلا وهن كمان ما تنسى انه الدول النفطية مش either or، يعني مش انه يا بحطوا الانفستمنت بالكربون كابتشر اند ستورج او بحطوها باشياء تنمويه اكثر. يعني فيهم يعملوا هاي وهاي، خاصة انه الكربون كابتشر اند ستورج بالنسبة لهم مسألة حيوية. يعني اليوم نحن كمنطقة عربية، وإذا بدنا ناخد نشتغل مع جامعة الدول العربية ومع المناطق عنا ومختلفة هي. يعني نحن انه we have to acknowledge انه مناطقنا فيها diversity واوضاع اقتصاديه واجتماعيه مختلفه. بقى بدنا نلاقي القاسم المشترك. يعني هيدي بالنسبه للكربون كابتشر اند ستورج. بالنسبه للفاينانس لازم نركز، انا بفتكر على موضوع الفاينانس ما حكينا كفايه ب آليات الفاينانس، خاصة انه عم بينحكى مثل ما قلت شو اسمه اللوس اند دامج، انه يكون الفندنج بالورلد بانك. انا معك 100%. نقدر نركز عليها، بس بدك آلية مضبوطة تقدر تطلع عليها، ما تروح من مجال الفندنج لغير، خاصة للتكيف مع تغير المناخ. وشو كمان، وموضوع الادابتيشن، يعني بده يكون في اكثر سبورت. هلا الدول رح تمشي كثير بموضوع دور القطاع الخاص، وانا بفتكر من هلا لوقتها لازم نطلع بشكل كثير اكثر معمق شو هن الاليات يلي معروضه يلي البرايفت سيكتور بيقدر تمويل المناخ. أنا بفتكر إنه البرايفت سيكتور ما لازم يكون بديل للجلوبال، للترانسفير، يعني الاو دي اي، الاوفرسيز ديفلوبمنت للدول. وهيدي يعني أنا بفتكر في مجال كتير كبير نطلع على موضوع الفاينانس من هلا لوقتها، من هلا ل الكوب 28. ومثل ما قلت أنا بفتكر موضوع النزاعات، vulnerable states، إعادة أعمار لازم تكون بأول الافتتاحية. أنا موافقة معك بهاي النقطة. شكرا.
شكرا. في أي حدا بعد عنده مداخلة أو تفضلي هلا. مين؟
أنا أكيد بوافق مع الزملاء معنا. بفتكر إيه، أولا موضوع النزاعات هيدي لازم نرجع نحكي عن هذا الموضوع، يكون الستيتمنت. هلا نحن عم نحضر كمبادرة إصلاح العربي مع غير مؤسسات وكمان مع أفراد مش بس مؤسسات، أنه موضوع النزاعات اليوم لازم يكون الأولوية على هذا صعيد المؤتمر. الأطراف، خاصة أنه النزاعات بكل هالسنين عم بيأثروا على البيئة، وعم نشوف بعد 20 سنة الإمباكت. شفنا بغير بالعراق، بالفيتنام، لهلأ في ملوثات موجودة وعم تأثر على الصحة العامة للعالم اللي عايشين بهالبيئة. وثانيا بفتكر بموضوع الكلايمت فاينانس الكونديشناليتيز، يعني شو عم نحط، مين رح يصير، يعني شو الميكانيزمز ومين رح يكون مسؤول عن التمويل، وشو هن المشاريع اللي عن جد رح ياخذوا التمويل مباشر، ومين رح يقرر، وهل في محاسبة. يعني هل هن الدول يعني هل هن الدول اللي رح يكونوا عم بياخذوا هالتمويل وعم بيوزعوا للباقيين، او المجتمع المدني او غير جهات معنية بالمجتمع اللي نحن فيه. وثالثا ما عم نحكي عنه هو اكيد البنك الدولي، بس كل المؤسسات الدولية، يعني صندوق النقد الدولي وغيرهم، لكل هالسنين حاطين شروط كمان انه، وعم نشوف خاصة كمان الاتحاد الأوروبي هلا عم بيدفش أكثر وأكثر من وراء النزاعات واللي عم بيصير، أنه موضوع اللاجئين أنه لا خلونا عندكم بالدول الجنوب، ونحن ما بدنا لاجئين يجوا على أوروبا. فهذا الشيء كمان لازم نشوف أنه نحن هذا بين الجنوب والشمال مزبوط، ننسى هذا الموضوع، بس هذا كتير مهم. انه كل هالسنين في اكيد في الهيستوريكال ريسبونسبيلتيز، بس نفس الوقت في حدا بده يدفع الثمن. وهيدي بنرجع على موضوع انه دول الشمال لازم يكون عندهم دور فعال اكثر بهذا الموضوع. وبنرجع نحكي عن موضوع العدالة، اكيد اللي مش موجودة بهالعدالة، الجاستس، انه ما عم نحكي عن موضوع العدالة وهذه كمان لها علاقة بالنزاعات، يعني لها علاقة بكل السيستم اللي نحن فيه، الرأسمالية اللي موجود، اللي هو بيأثر كمان على طريقة الديسيجنز وكل شيء، سياسات عم تنفرض علينا، وطريقة كمان الغذاء وهالسيستمز اللي موجودين. نحن بنحكي عن الفود سيكيورتي، وبننسى انه بالفود سيكيورتي انه في فود سوفرنتي. اليوم عم نشوف انه المحلات، حتى يمكن حكيت قبل شوي زينة، انه في مناطق حتى بلبنان عم بيقولوا بدنا نستثمر الاراضي لنحط سولار بانلز. طب لمين هالأراضي؟ هل بدهم أهل هالمدن أو هالضيعة بدهم الأراضي تبعولهم يستثمر فيهم؟
سهل عم تخلوا التراب.
انه كمان انه اليوم هالمناطق زراعيه، ليش بدنا نرجع على غير شيء؟ يعني كمان نرجع على التراديشنز، التقاليد اللي عنا اياها. يعني هيدي كمان مهمة، يعني كأنه عم نغير نمط حياتنا، بس نحن عم ننسى أنه نحن بدنا نكبر ونتحسن، بيكون في تنمية، بس عم ما ننسى أنه الأراضي واللاند جرابينج كمان هيدي مشاكل كتير كبيرة، وعم تنفرض علينا من قبل البنك الدولي وغيرهم بهذا الأجندة السياسية الدولية، أنه رأسمالية وإتسترا. شكرا.
في أنا
سوري
بس كان في حلا رافعة ايدها، بنرجع لعندكم. تفضلي حلا.
شكرا لكم. بشكل سريع، أنا بتفق مع الأستاذ حبيبي موضوع احتجاز الكربون وكل الفيك سوليوشن اللي ممكن تتصدر، اتفقوا عليها الغرب أو لا، هل هي أولويتنا أو لا؟ هذا السؤال كتير كتير مهم، لأنه اليوم أيضا في مبالغ مالية ممكن تكون مهمة جدا تنصرف باتجاهات لها علاقة بالتخفيف، اللي بنأكد عليها إنه زيادة التدفقات المالية للتخفيف هي واحدة من النقاط اللي كتير مهمة، ولكن للأسف كمان الحلول الخاطئة عم تاخذ كتير من التمويلات. يعني مش معناها انه هل بنتفق كدول عربيه او ما بنتفق، هي الفكره المصلحه العامه. يعني انا اذا بدي اتفق مع دول الخليج، انا ما بشتغلش على تغير المناخ كله، يعني الملف كله مش من اولوياتهم اكيد. فالفكره الاساسيه انه المفروض انه نتعاطى مع هذا الملف على انه ملف قد ياخذ كثير من التمويلات، وبالتالي قد لا يكون هذا جزء من الحل، ولا يكون حتى جزء من الريزيلينس والمنعة والتصدي لتبعات تغير المناخ على مستوى منطقتنا. هذه أول نقطة، يعني بس بحب أكد عليها، حكاها الأستاذ حبيب. ومن وجهة نظر ثانية هي مهمة جدا بما يرتبط بعلاقتها بالتمويل. نقل التكنولوجيا أكيد من النقاط اللي كتير مهمة، واللي أيضا نقاط اللي غابت اليوم ولم تعد من النقاط اللي كتير بينحكى عنها، ولكن في شبكة سان دياغو، في كتير من الحوارات اللي عم بتصير اليوم واللي انحكى عنها بشرم الشيخ كمان ممكن تأسس. بس المشكلة إنه الملفات هاي بتطلع وبتنزل، فمهم إذا حطيناها بتوصياتنا ممكن تكون أعلى للوصول. تكنولوجيا بناء القدرات، حتى يكون في دعم حقيقي للمجتمعات المحلية. النقطة الثانية اللي بدي أثيرها بما يرتبط بقضايا التمويل، صندوق التكيف على سبيل المثال وصندوق التخفيف اللي هم موجودين حاليا، الكلايمت ادابتيشن فند أو حتى الGCF، كلاهما لديه اعتمادات كتير عالية واشتراطات كتير كبيرة، لدرجة أنه معظم التمويلات حتى في بلاد الجنوب وفي بلادنا تذهب إلى UN agencies. وهاي كمان نقطة بتخيل أنه يجب تفاديها بصندوق الخسائر والأضرار. يجب أن نعنون قضايا حقوق الإنسان والعدالة على أنها هي الأساس لمن سيذهب الفند. إذا بده يرجع الفند يذهب تحت مظلة صندوق البنك الدولي، ومن ثم يذهب تحت تطبيق وتنفيذ بعض المؤسسات الأممية. أنا لا يعني لن أكون حققت أي شيء فيما يرتبط بفلسفة وجود صندوق الخسائر والأضرار. فلازم يمكن هاي النقطة نعطيها شوي تفنيد بما يرتبط بواقعنا، بما يرتبط بالتدفقات المالية اللي وصلتنا سابقا وتحليلها وانعكاسها علينا. النقطة الثانية بما يرتبط بالخسائر والأضرار وعشناها بشرم الشيخ، بما يرتبط بمنطقتنا، أننا لا تعتبر منطقتنا بشكل كبير من المناطق التي لديها حساسية عالية للخسارة والضرر. وهي كثير من النقاشات دارت، ولدرجة أن أول مسودة خرجت في شرم الشيخ تتحدث عن من سيكون في اللجنة العليا التنفيذية لصندوق الخسارة والضرر، الذي سحبت بعد ذلك وأجري عليها مناقشات إلى اليوم. لم تكن منطقة غرب آسيا من المناطق الممثلة على سبيل المثال، وهي منطقتنا سقطت سهوا، غابت، ليس هنالك ممثل يتحدث عنها، لا أعلم. ولكن القصة أننا كيف نجسد الخسارة والضرر. هل الخسارة والضرر ولازم تتدمر بيوتنا، ولازم يكون في فيضان طام بعد زي اللي حدث بليبيا. بس اليوم كمان في شاهد ليبيا كتير مهم نسلط الضوء عليه. ولا الخسارة والضرر ممكن نقيسها بمشاهد تانية وأولويات تانية. كتير مهم نحكي عن طبيعة الخسارة والضرر اللي قد تتشكل في منطقتنا، المنطقة اللي عندها حضارة قديمة اجتماعية وثقافية، ممكن تتأثر أيضا وتكون الخسائر غير المادية مهمة في هذا الصدد ينحكى عنها بشكل واضح. ما بدي أطيل أكثر، بس قضية اللاجئين كمان أعتقد في بلادنا تأثرهم وأثرهم يعني برضه هم من الفئات نحتضن، إن كان في لبنان، في الأردن، في مصر، نحتضن أعداد لاجئين أكثر من أي مناطق تانية في كل العالم. وبالتالي هاي النقطة كمان لازم الإضاءة عليها من ناحية تغير المناخ، من ناحية العلاقة الإنسانية والعلاقة الاجتماعية والتمكين وحياتهم وحقوقهم. علاقة أعتقد أنها تبادلية مع تغير المناخ. ويجب أن يكون في بداية الموقف تبعنا أكيد موقف مشدد على فكرة النزاع وتمويل النزاع واستمراريته وتجذره في منطقتنا، اللي أيضا يأخذ من حقوقنا التمويلية، ويأخذ أيضا من يعني الإمباكت تبعه، الأثر الطويل المدى اللي قد يكون بالإضافة لتغير المناخ أثاره أكثر كارثية وأكثر عمقا على المجتمعات المحلية. شكرا جزيلا لكم.
شكرا هلا، تفضل.
اوكي انا اكيد بوافق على الافكار اللي انحكت قبل، بس في كم فكره يعني. فكره انه نحن الكوب عم بيصير بمنطقتنا، تمثيل يعني للشباب بالمنطقه. يعني ما سمعنا انه في شباب مثلا مصري او اماراتي صوتهم بالكوب، وهيدا شيء مهم يعني يكون نقطه مهمه. الشغله الثانيه الاعلام وتسقيف الإعلام للناس بالكوب، يعني لأنه بنحس في فصل تام بين الناس والكوب، يعني ما كتير ناس بتعرف على الكوب. فكمان هون ما نشوف كيف قديش فينا تبوش للإعلام ليغطي أو يكون عنده المعرفة يعني يوعي الناس على أهمية الكوب بمنطقتنا العربية. والشغلة الثالثة فكرة التكنولوجيا يعني اللي عم تجي وتجي اسقاطات علينا، والحلول مثل الطاقة الشمسية. مين قال انه الطاقة الشمسية هي الحل بالطاقة المتجددة؟ يعني هي أسئلة. مين قال السيارات الكهربائية هي الحل كمان بالتنقل، خاصة نحن بنشتغل على موضوع التنقل. ففي كتير أفكار وبروباغندا عم تنحط لا أهداف يعني أكيد استفادات يعني صناعية خلينا نقول، لأنه في ناس عندها الباور تقدر تحطها بالكوب. فكمان لازم نسأل حالنا يعني كيف فينا نحن نرجع نسترد جزء من هيدي القوة ونعطيها للناس، لأهل منطقتنا وثقافة منطقتنا. ويعطيكم العافية.
شكرا لك. هل في مداخلات إضافية أو أجوبة على القضايا يلي انطرحت؟
بقدر بس أحكي إشي صغير إذا تكرمتي؟
تفضلي.
أنا بس بدي أقول إنه بالأردن على سبيل المثال السنة الماضية تم تحضير 6 شباب كانوا ضمن الوفد الرسمي المفاوض، وكانوا جزء أيضا من حركة المجتمع المدني. والسنة هاي تم اختيار 5 من ضمنهم شابة من جمعية دبين للتنمية البيئية، رح تكون أيضا ممثلة لقطاع الشباب. يتم الآن أيضا تدريبهم وتحضيرهم حتى يكونوا جزء من العملية وانخراطهم. أنا فقط أجيب على الأستاذ الذي سأل على موضوع، وأنا لا أعلم بباقي الدول هل هنالك أي إجراءات لها علاقة بتمكين الشباب وإفادهم أو لا. شكرا.
أنا بفتكر يعني لازم نزيد بركن أن نركز على موضوع الفود sovereignty, droughts and water. هو اللي مهمين كتير إنه كمنطقتنا يعني نقدر أول شيء ربط الأمن الغذائي بالأمن المائي، وهذه المي عنا كتير مهمة، والتصحر والجفاف يعني كتير مهمين. في شغلة تانية اليوم نحن ما تطرقنا إلها بهالموضوع بحلقتنا لليوم ولمبارح، بس في اتجاه عالمي لإعادة النظر، لأنه عم نحكي بإعادة هيكلة النظام المالي العالمي. في كمان اتجاه ل إعادة طرح بركي مفهوم الدولة الرعوية، الويلفير ستيت. وهي نقطة يمكن مهمة نقدر نرجع نطلع فيها، لأنه من بعد الكوارث اللي صارت من كورونا ومن أمن غذائي ومن حروب، في أكتر استعداد من يعني إعادة النظر باللي كانوا البنك الدولي يطلع بس إنه وقف البرايفتايز وتطلع على السيفتي نت لحالها، واليوم إعادة الاعتبار لدور
الرعاية.
exactly بقى يعني هلا يمكن it's too soon نحطها توصية بس خلينا نطلع فيها أكتر. أوكي بس هيك.
شكرا لكم جميعا، وأكيد نحن كلنا ناطرين ورقة الموقف يلي حيشتغل عليها أستاذ حبيب، ورح نتشاركها معكم أكيد. وإذا عندكم أي استفسار فيكم تبعتوا لنا إياه بالإيميل، وأكيد نحن بنتشاركهم مع الميسرين والمقدمين يلي كانوا معنا اليوم لحتى نتابع. أكيد في نقاشات كتير بعد، وكان نقاش غني اليوم، وكان الحضور كمان أحسن من امبارح، فهذا شيء مشجع. شكرا لكم جميعا، و have a nice evening.
شكرا لك على الإدارة وعلى كل التيم تبعكم ريلي.
طبعا أكيد نتشكر الانتربريترز وفريق هندسة الصوت وكل العالم يلي ساهموا بإنجاح هذا الاجتماع.
شكرا لكم، يعطيكم العافية.